The Conqueror. In 1956, The Conqueror hit screens with one of old Hollywood's most bewildering casting choices, John Wayne as Genghis Khan. Known for rugged cowboys and battle-hardened soldiers, Wayne's turn as the 12th century Mongol warlord drew immediate skepticism. Even by mid-century standards, the decision reeked of miscasting, with Wayne delivering stilted lines in a desert setting that looked more like Utah than Central Asia. Directed by Dick Powell and backed by Howard Hughes, the film faltered under wooden dialogue, cultural blunders, and an overall lack of vision. It bombed with critics and audiences alike, quickly becoming a symbol of Hollywood's blind spots. Yet its true infamy lies in what happened off-screen. Shot near St. George, Utah, just downwind from the Nevada test site, the location had been exposed to radioactive fallout from nuclear tests in the early 1950s. In the decades that followed, an alarming number of cast and crew, including Susan Hayward, Pedro Armendariz, and Wayne himself, were diagnosed with cancer. Some sources estimate as many as 91 people connected to the film were affected. Though causation remains debated, the shadow cast by that fallout has lingered. Howard Hughes, reportedly guilt-ridden, purchased and shelved the film for years. Today, The Conqueror stands not just as a cinematic misfire, but as a chilling reminder of production choices with real-world costs. Robot Monster. Released in 1953, Robot Monster has earned its place in cinematic infamy. Not for brilliance, but for utter confusion. Filmed in just 4 days on a shoestring budget reportedly between $16,000 and $20,000, the production featured a villain named Roman, portrayed by an actor in a gorilla suit with a diving helmet. Intended to be a menacing alien, Roman instead became an unintentional mascot for low-budget absurdity. Critics at the time dismissed the film outright, with trade publications calling it a theatrical dud. Film historian Bill Warren noted its heavy reliance on stock footage. Everything from prehistoric creatures to space scenes resulted in a narrative that felt more like a patchwork experiment than a cohesive story. Dialogue such as, "I cannot, yet I must, how do you calculate that?" became a punchline among film buffs. While some reports have exaggerated its earnings, the film did achieve modest financial success relative to its budget, likely boosted by the novelty of its 3D presentation. Rumors suggest that curious audiences flocked to theaters simply to see if it was as bad as the buzz claimed. Decades later, Robot Monster became a cult classic, often mentioned in the same breath as Plan 9 from Outer Space, a film so catastrophically flawed it somehow became unforgettable. The Story of Mankind. In 1957, MGM gambled big on what it hoped would be a sweeping cinematic statement, The Story of Mankind. Stacked with marquee names like Vincent Price, Hedy Lamarr, Peter Lorre, and Ronald Colman, the film also marked the rare appearance of all three Marx Brothers, though not in the same scenes. Groucho bought Manhattan, Chico played a monk, and Harpo, naturally silent, portrayed Sir Isaac Newton. The concept? A celestial courtroom trial debating whether humanity deserved to survive, told through a whirlwind of historical reenactments. The execution? A chaotic blend of moralizing, mismatched tone, and clunky storytelling. Critics were swift and brutal. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called it a ponderous pageant, with pedestrian narration and stale dramatizations. Audiences didn't disagree. The film struggled to attract audiences and faded quickly from theaters. A few film historians propose it was rushed to tap into Cold War fears, with its closing scenes hinting at nuclear catastrophe. Others argue it was simply a misguided attempt to blend educational drama with star-studded spectacle. Either way, The Story of Mankind is now often cited as a prime example of old Hollywood overreach, an overreaching flop many believe never should have made it to theatrical release. The Giant Claw. Released in 1957 by Columbia Pictures, The Giant Claw was pitched as a Cold War-era sci-fi thriller, but it quickly became notorious for all the wrong reasons. The story followed a monstrous bird from an antimatter galaxy, but the creature's bizarre puppet design, complete with wild eyes, wiry hair, and a beak resembling a holiday ornament, turned terror into comedy. Lead actor Jeff Morrow reportedly didn't see the final monster until the film's premiere. According to his own later interviews, he left the theater early, stunned by the audience's laughter. Behind the scenes, the studio had quietly outsourced the effects to a low-budget shop in Mexico, a decision that blindsided the cast and derailed the film's tone. Director Fred F. Sears had aimed for a serious allegory on nuclear anxiety, but the absurd visuals shattered any dramatic tension. Critics dismissed the film and it bombed in ticket sales. While Morrow's leading roles declined afterward, Sears passed away later that year, cutting short any potential rebound. Over time, the Giant Claw gained cult status as a classic example of mid-century cinematic mishaps. So infamous that some movie fans joke it should have sidestepped cinemas entirely and gone straight to VHS, if only that it existed in the 50s. Mesa of Lost Women. Mesa of Lost Women is often referred to as one of the strangest fiascos of Hollywood's so-called golden age. Released in 1953, this low-budget sci-fi horror film was co-directed by Ron Ormond and Herbert Tevos, though some believe the chaotic structure hints at even more uncredited hands in the mix. The film's plot, if it can be called that, centers on a mad scientist experimenting with spider hormones on women in a remote place called Zarpa Mesa, supposedly to create a race of seductive super beings. The result was a disjointed mess, stitched together with recycled footage from an earlier abandoned project titled Tarantula. Actor Lyle Talbot's monotone narration was added in post-production to unite the scrambled scenes, a move that only heightened the confusion. The soundtrack, composed by Hoyt Curtin, was originally intended for another film and featured relentless flamenco guitar that clashed with the desert setting. Curtin would later become a household name for scoring Hanna-Barbera classics like The Flintstones and The Jetsons, making his early involvement in this film even more curious. Critics at the time were reportedly bewildered, with some newspapers allegedly refusing to publish reviews. Rumors from theater owners claim audiences walked out midway, especially during the endless flamenco sequences. The cast included Jackie Coogan, once a beloved child star, and Harmon Stevens, but even their names couldn't salvage the film's reception. Over time, Mesa of Lost Women slipped into public domain, fueling its cult status through midnight TV slots and bad movie marathons. It's often compared to Plan 9 from Outer Space, though that film came 6 years later. Still, both share a legacy of being so poorly executed that many argue they never should have appeared on the big screen at all, let alone be recalled decades later. The Black Sleep. The Black Sleep, released in 1956, arrived with a cast that read like a horror hall of fame. Basil Rathbone, Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney Jr., and John Carradine. But the film's promise ended at the poster. Critics at the time dismissed it as a clunky, low-budget dud, with Variety calling it uneven and lacking suspense. Lugosi, in one of his final roles, portrayed a mute servant, an intentional choice, though some speculated it was a workaround due to his declining health. His gaunt appearance and silent presence stirred rumors that the role was more symbolic than scripted. Lon Chaney Jr., another horror heavyweight, was relegated to a near-silent brute role, sparking criticism that the film wasted its legendary ensemble. The plot, centered on a surgeon experimenting on unwilling patients, felt like a recycled Frankenstein knockoff, and the execution didn't help. Pacing issues, clunky dialogue, and awkward performances dragged the film down. While some horror fans revisit it for its cast, others argue it's a prime example of old Hollywood's fading grip on the genre. Whispers in fan circles suggest the film was fast-tracked to capitalize on the final embers of its star's fame. Whether true or not, The Black Sleep is often remembered less for its story and more as a curious footnote in horror history. The Flying Saucer. The Flying Saucer, released in January of 1950, rode the wave of post-Roswell UFO fascination with bold marketing that claimed it was the first film to depict a flying saucer on screen. In truth, the saucer barely appeared. Blink and it was gone. Directed, produced, and led by Mikko Conrad, a relatively unknown actor with no prior directing experience, the film aimed for Cold War intrigue, but landed somewhere between travelogue and low-budget spy flick. Critics weren't kind. Contemporary reviews described it as a half-hearted thriller dressed in sci-fi packaging, with Variety reportedly dismissing it as a quick cash-in on UFO mania. Film historian Bill Warren later echoed that sentiment, calling it more espionage than extraterrestrial. Others propose the lack of saucer footage was due to budget constraints, while some claim it was a calculated move to stoke curiosity. Either way, the result left audiences disappointed. Despite being shot on location in Alaska, the film's visuals failed to compensate for its sluggish pacing and thin plot. Instead of launching a new genre, The Flying Saucer quickly faded from theaters and landed in the annals of missed cinematic opportunities. Often cited today as a film that might have fared better never seeing the big screen, heading straight for a dusty VHS shelf. Catwoman of the Moon. Released in 1953, Catwoman of the Moon rode the wave of Hollywood's short-lived three-dimensional craze, but lacked the polish to keep it afloat. By the time it reached cinemas, audiences had already seen sharper three-dimensional spectacles like Buona Devil and House of Wax, making this low-budget lunar adventure feel like a cheap imitation. The plot centered on male astronauts discovering a telepathic moon colony governed by women, an idea that promised novelty, but delivered clumsy stereotypes and stilted dialogue. Production shortcuts were glaring, shaky sets, visible wires, and effects that seemed more like stage props than science fiction. Critics were not impressed. While specific reviews vary, the general consensus labeled it as uninspired and technically feeble. Film historians often group it with other offbeat mishaps of the period, such as Fire Maidens from Outer Space and Robot Monster, both notorious for their accidental hilarity. Quite a few fans suggest that Catwoman was hurried to capitalize on the three-dimensional boom, compromising quality for speed. Others allude to rumors that it was approved based on a studio executive's fixation with space-age pin-up aesthetics. Whatever the cause, its theatrical unveiling left many dumbfounded, and in retrospect it's often noted as a movie that might have found a better fate, or at least sparked less shame, had it sidestepped the cinematic circuit and landed straight into the discount stack of the VHS era. The Neanderthal Man. Released in 1953, The Neanderthal Man was advertised as a dire warning about meddling with evolution. Instead, it tripped into disgrace as one of mid-century Hollywood's most jeered science fiction calamities. Directed by Ewald André Dupont, formerly a towering figure in Germany's silent film era, the undertaking was miles away from his once-acclaimed achievements. The plot follows a researcher who injects himself with a formula that sends him back to a bestial state. On paper, the concept hinted at Frankenstein-style ambition. On screen, it devolved into an awkward brew of wooden acting, recycled dialogue, and makeup effects that provoked chuckles instead of terror. Reviewers at the time were unrestrained. Trade journals derided the visuals, with one remarking that the title character resembled a leftover from a discount costume party. The tempo dragged, and any hope for tension dissolved under its own pretensions. Audiences felt the same. The movie soon vanished from theaters within a few weeks of its June debut, leaving behind barely a ripple in ticket sales. Aside from sporadic scholarly references, it failed to secure a cult audience or find a repeat airing on television. Several movie scholars maintain that its flop caused studios to hesitate over de-evolution plots for some time. Others insist it simply signaled the downfall of DuPont's Tinseltown standing. Either way, The Neanderthal Man remains regularly cited as a classic illustration of a film that likely should have bypassed theaters from the start, a prehistoric blunder consigned to the forgotten vaults of old Hollywood errors. Glenda. Released in 1953, Glenda remains one of cinema's most bewildering anomalies, a film many argue never should have existed, yet somehow lingers in cultural memory. Directed by Ed Wood under the pseudonym Daniel Davis, it was conceived to capitalize on Christine Jorgensen's headline-making gender transition. But instead of a straightforward exploitation flick, Wood delivered a jumbled hybrid of docu-commentary, surreal interludes, and the personal confession. Bela Lugosi, reduced by then to fringe projects, appeared as a cryptic narrator known only as the Scientist, delivering non-sequiturs like "pull the string" that echoed long after the credits rolled. The structure was nearly indecipherable but undeniably earnest, an oddball act of cinematic vulnerability wrapped in low-budget chaos. Though mocked and ignored upon release, with critics branding it incoherent and distributors hesitant to screen it, Glenda eventually gained cult status. What it lacked in craft, it offered in raw intent. In an America still rigidly silent on gender identity, Wood's clumsy yet heartfelt portrayal of cross-dressing was one of the rare attempts to broach the subject on screen. It wasn't polished, and certainly wasn't profitable. But in its own strange, trembling way, it was ahead of its time. Today, it endures not for its execution, but for its fearless and deeply personal existence. The Deadly Mantis. Released in 1957 by Universal International, The Deadly Mantis descended from a lineage of Cold War-era monster flicks hoping to profit from the atomic behemoth trend popularized by earlier successes like Them and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Yet where it aimed for suspense, it sparked uneasy laughter. The giant mantis, a large rigid model, looked so implausible that its jerky, slow-motion came across as unintentionally funny. Critics showed little enthusiasm. A New York Times write-up from May of that year labeled it a routine monster picture, suffering from a lack of imagination. The film stretched its running time with clips of military exercises and radar imagery, resulting in prolonged segments resembling documentary filler. Characters adhered to a genre template: the resolute scientist, the doubting general, and the token female journalist, inserted with minimal justification. Even though it rolled out nationwide, the movie barely registered financially and quickly vanished from theaters. Plenty of sources claim the production was sped up to hit a marketing window, a frequent move in the 50s monster craze. Over the years, The Deadly Mantis resurfaced, not as a late-blooming cult gem, but as comedic fodder. Its spot on Mystery Science Theater 3000 in 1997 showcased it to fresh audiences, sealing its status as a picture that arguably belonged off the silver screen and into the clearance shelf. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.